Welcome to another edition of, or another episode, not edition, of Bookish, a casual book club. I am Kofi Adisa, and I'm here with two of my favorite people, Sylvia Lee and Laura Yu.
Hello.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year. And so today we will be talking about another S.A Cosby book. Last time we did Razor Blade Tears, and today we're doing All the Sinners Bleed. This is a book that follows a sheriff in a southern town, a small southern county in rural Virginia. And the backdrop is that there's a fall festival that's tied to the Confederacy or the Sons of the Confederacy. At the same time, there is a serial killer that the lead character, Titus Crown, has to find before the serial killer strikes again. The wonderful thing I get out of S.A Cosby's writing is that it is, on one level, kind of lyrical. Mm-hmm. There are all these sort of Southern sayings, if you will, and it is a fast-paced book, but there are periods where it slows down and you have these emotional, or at least I had these emotional responses to, and part of that is that he is living with his father, who is a recovering alcoholic, and became so after the loss of his wife and Titus and Marquise's mom. And that is sort of one of those underlying layers of the book that I found resonating with me, partly because my mom passed a few years ago. But the other part is that there was just some of these emotional moments where the brothers are trying to reconcile that loss. And I think that is a gem of his. Like with the last book, Razor Blade Tears, there's this absence of some meaningful part of your familial identity, whether in Razor Blade Tears, it was sons. In this case, it's a mom. And I think that sense of loss is something to interrogate a little more, and I want to see how it plays out in some of his other works. But I really, really enjoyed the book from the opening scene to the end of the scene. And I think I shared with Laura and Sylvia that one of the things that I think he does very well is open and close scenes. I mean, he just, does it extraordinarily well. I'm not going to bore you with reading you a scene. I leave that to my other co-hosts to do. But it is definitely an emotional book. If you have children, by the way, it'll make you feel anxious in some cases. The idea that the serial killer is targeting children, teenagers to be exact, and I have teenage kids. That was also very compelling, and it made me want to read more. Your thoughts, Laura?
We didn't talk about this before, but I think this is going to have spoilers. So I just want to put it out there because I do want to talk about the ending as well. But speaking of serial killers targeting children, while I was reading it, I really thought, there are some people I would not recommend this book to, who I know who don't like reading either it's something that's violent or that has to do with specifically sexual violence and involving children. So the aspect of the school shooting scene, which sort of is the first major crime that happens like in the beginning of the book, it made me think, oh my gosh, he is throwing everything into this book. You think the book is going to be about one thing. And then when Sylvia and I were walking over here, we kind of like ran through the list of all the things that are in the book. We have school shooting. We have these like controversial religious cultish, right, behaviors or issues. There's violence, there's sexual violence, there's violence against children as part of that. There's also extremist views on race and the violence that stems from that, and corrupt cops, right? And the police department. And of course, the main character is a sheriff. So just when you think like, oh, this book is going to be about what a school shooting. And then it turns out to be so much more than that. And yet, as I read it, I didn't feel distracted. They all seem to sort of connect well, or he's connecting them well so that it is one cohesive story, which really is a representation of a community, right? Like there's no one isolated issue. Almost all issues are interconnected. And so, when there's a school shooting, is it just about guns? Is it just about violence? But no, it's also about schools. It's also about the police department and so on, or race and other issues. So I thought he does a great job here of weaving all of that together to tell us a really complex story that's not just about one thing, Yeah.
It sucks going last because then all the things I wanted to say, you guys have already said it. So I'm like, I agree. So if anyone who's listening remembers our last episode on S.A Cosby, where we talked a little bit about his background as an author, you will recall that, in one of the interviews he gave, he talks a lot about, crafting a storyline and crafting a story. And so, when he was a kid, his mom would read him like those fairy tale stories and he'd just pick out the plot holes in the stories and decide to make his own. And you can really see that come together. I think this is such a well-crafted story in and of itself. As we were walking here, Laura and I were talking about how, Razorblade Tears has been opted for a movie, I think, by Bruckheimer, right? All the Sinners Bleed, I think, would make a better long-form series like True Detective. Like, I could see it in that genre, in that format, because you really want to get all the elements of the story, like, in, together to kind of do it justice. Because I think, to Laura's point, I don't think any one thing was the central incident. The school shooting, actually, it's the inciting incident that gets us into the novel. But after that, you don't really hear about it that much. And no, it's not a school shooting in the sense that we understand it in terms of students being targeted. It's just one target and you come to find out why. And, even the main sort of crime that makes this thriller a crime thriller, the serial killer and kind of hunting him down in and of itself is also not necessarily the central. It becomes the primary plot, but there's so much more feeding the story, I think, including Titus's past, right? Which is always colliding with his current situation. And the more you learn about where he's come from and why he's in this sheriff position, which is an elected position in a very rural southern county. And he's the first Black man to hold that title and surprise everybody by getting elected. It's always sort of that political element is also always at play too. And so I found it was really interesting to kind of see how these crimes and everything that's happening around him is also centering on this very political thing where he is at all times aware of his position in the county and what that means to certain folks within the county as well, right? He's representing, finally the Black residents of the county, but at the same time, as soon as he gets into that position, they start looking at him with a little bit of distrust too, right? And then in the meantime, he's kind of grappling with all the stuff from his past that is really interfering or impacting his ability and the choices he makes as he is pursuing this killer. And so I thought it was really interesting. And at the same time, he's got some really great team members, some really great detectives and people who work with him that you see him trying to raise up and empower them to become the next generation. There's so much going on in there that I just found it to be such a it sounds strange because we're talking about shootings and killers, but such a delightful read. Again, it's not about the actual incidents, but it's really about, everything that this character, which is such a realized character, is experiencing. I really found his relationship with his brother Marquise to be very special too. The fact that they don't talk. Marquise never comes home. He wants to avoid that and, leaves his dad and Titus, his brother, to kind of pick up the emotional pieces and do it. But at the same time, Marquise is very loyal to Titus.
Yeah.
And that resonated with me because it's a different kind of loyalty that I think you can only have with your siblings who you don't get along with and you might hate, but then when push comes to shove, they're going to punch the lights out of someone and talk bad about you. Not that happened in the book. Maybe you'll have to read to find out. I actually liked this. I enjoyed this better than Razorblade Tears.
Yeah, when you said that in our chat, I thought, okay, well, now I guess I have to read it now. And I'm still on the fence if, comparatively, do I prefer this book as opposed to Razor Blade Tears, or do I see this as being a better book? And I think I do, but I'm not sure I do. There's a bigger critique, by the way, I think, in this book that is much more societal. And I think it's in Razor Blade Tears as well. But I think it's really, really critiquing the notions of what race is and isn't as a construct. And it's also a critique on how religion or the religiosity of race comes into play, so you think about Elias and being a snake handler. You think about Jamal Anderson and the sort of the black church. I think these are all definitely tropes that he's playing with, but I think he's also making a larger critique about how we engage in these conversations. Like, you would have, I think it was Davy, one of the deputies, was saying that not everybody's a racist who was on the sort of the Sons of Confederacy. And it's like, okay, so they're
specious. Okay.
They're awfully comfortable with being around racists. I think Titus's background as being a former FBI,
highly educated in a community that the limitations are so pronounced and so ingrained. And I think Darlene represents that county the most because when she was fleeing, that was one of the points she was making, that she had never been out of the Mid-Atlantic and she's never done these various things because so much of Chiron, that's, I think, Chiron, right? It's the Greek. The river.
Yeah, like the river Styx. And so I think that has been all encompassing. And so people know their places, and Titus represents a disruption of that, becoming the first black sheriff. And I think there's also that critique of what it means to be the first person of color in these positions. And you also have that with Dr. Kim, who's as an Asian woman in the ME office and probably the head ME at that. So there's all these different kinds of critiques happening. And maybe it's not really a critique, but because I have a literature background, we always look at things in terms of critique, and that might not be necessarily true. But it just feels like there is a bigger point about it. And even the serial killer is kind of a critique on what we think of serial killers. Yeah. And I think that's what made this book so different from Razor Blade Tears, because Razor Blade Tears feels like a vengeance narrative.
It's a revenge narrative, and it's very much like a city folk, country folk type of trope there. I think this one, like a common thread that I see between the two that speaks to a little bit of what you're talking about, is also the role of like reason versus unreason, right? Or like the educated way that. The fact that he's very educated and the way he's thinking about things logically, it is a language that is familiar to me, but so is the language that some of these other folk, the country folks, I use that with air quotes, are coming at things like the kind of reasoning that says, oh, just because I'm part of the Sons of Confederacy doesn't mean I'm a racist. And you're as a reader and Titus, we're thinking of the same thing, like, make it make sense. The math doesn't math here. But also his relationship to religion. Right. And the fact that he has forsaken religion because of all the stuff that's happened to his mother. And yet he is constantly pulled back into these kind of faith-based arguments and ways of thinking about things, morality and the world and all of this. And how in some ways that is actually the reason why that gives rise to this evil in the county that we come to find out where the killer came from and why the killer came to be the way they are. A lot of it is tied to these ways of being and thinking in the world. And to me, it was a critique perhaps, right? On the role of education and the role of somebody who is in possession of that education and what it affords you. Because at the end, as we were talking about, Titus has options, right? And so he chose to leave the FBI because of some things that happened and come back to his podunk little, hometown and be the sheriff. But he also chose, and he had that agency to leave. And he had these choices that not a lot of people around him had. And so because of that, they make these other choices. Mm-hmm. And so I see this very much come up in Razor Blade Tears too, where, you know, you're thinking about, the city folk who think they're so smart and they're all educated, and then the country folk who may not have had the same kind of education, but they are the ones who are using like what they know and how people around them think to kind of track down the killers. And I thought it was an interesting kind of, I don't know if that makes any sense, but
no, it does.
I think what you said about making choices is actually making me think too about the killer, right? Mm-hmm. And how, you know, not as a excuse, but possibly as an explanation about where the killer's dementedness or whatever might have come from, and being treated so poorly as a mixed child, right? And don't
give it away. You're saying that spoiler alert.
It's spoiler, yeah. No, I mean, and then I think part of that though is, and the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because I wanted to talk about, just like we did in the Razor Blade, I want to talk about the women.
Oh yes, I can't wait to talk about the women.
We talked about last time how it is a very male-centered narrative, right? Like both Razor Blade and this one as well. However, in this book, All the Sinners Bleed, there are, number one, more women characters. And in smaller, but maybe collectively, I think they play a critical role in not only driving the narrative, but providing some context for Titus and other members of the community. And the reason why I brought up the killer is the mom, Polly, I had to write her name down, Polly Ann, right? Who basically at the end confesses her past. But not only that, Polly Ann explains what happened, how she, you know, gave birth and had to give up the baby. And the snake handler family, ended up raising him. Yeah. But it like added yet another layer when the nurse or the maid who follows Titus out of the house after he's done talking with Polly Ann, and she says, oh, you know, Polly Ann has been waiting for a long time to tell that story. And it was something about that detail that really didn't have to be there to move the narrative along, but to have another woman speak on behalf of this older woman, right, gave it more credibility, or right, to say this really is what happened, right, and is part of the narrative. But I thought that was like details like that I really appreciated it. And I forget the name of the nurse or the maid or whoever it
Natalie.
was. Yes. And he even named her. And I thought that was really interesting. And of course, I enjoyed Carla. Is it Carla?
Yep.
His deputy. And Darlene and Kelly, even Kelly, who is sort of representing his past that he can't let go. She keeps kind of jutting into his present and makes him remember, right, his past. But also then her coming into his life forces him to, one, face the past, but also make choices for the future, right? And forces Darlene and him to sort of come to a pass and make a decision about how they're going to move forward. So I loved all the women in the book who were, I thought, again, not huge roles, but collectively really important. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the main ones was his mom that is somewhat
absolutely
talked about.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you actually kind of experience her through either her sayings that he brings up or when he's having this moment of shock because of, you know, what he experiences in confronting the serial killer. And, you know, he has this moment where, you know, he's fading and then he hears, you know, his mom. And so, I think, Laura, there is this idea of, you know, sometimes in these crime fictions, women are just basically stand-ins and think about Robert B. Parker books, you know, or even Dashiell Hamlet. The women don't really serve a role, you know, other than the love interest and maybe it's some kind of a foil, but they're never really a fully developed character. And I think that many of the women, even the woman date, I guess it's Diane, who I guess was kind of a junkie and was kind of trying to protect the serial killer. Even she's somewhat a developed person. Yeah. And you can kind of understand each of the characters. Even Scott Cunningham, which if there was someone to play him, Scott Jennings on CNN would be the perfect guy, even though he's not an actor.
How you picture him?
That's how I picture him. I just, just sort of this guy who, and I think there were parts where you get inside Titus' head and he would see him as someone who's only rich in that county, but not really as wealthy as compared outside of that county, because they had this history with being the main providers at the fish factory and the flag factory. So they had this sort of ownership of the county. And Scott's the, chairman of the board of supervisors and sort of feels as if he can tell Titus what to do. And to your point, Sylvia, I think that when you are educated and you come from a group, a marginalized group, and you're confronting a rural population that is not used to that, that becomes disrupting. And they don't know how to handle that, yet he knows how to handle them. And I think that's another way of critiquing what these power dynamics actually work as. And it kind of reminded me of part of in James, where James is sort of teaching the students, the kids in the plantation, and Percival Everett's James, and basically saying, this is how you have to talk to white people because they need to feel superior. Whereas Titus, he doesn't care about that because he knows that's what they need, but he doesn't care. And in some ways, that is what I find interesting in connecting him to a serial killer, is that the serial killer doesn't care either. That the whole point of dismembering a body is to disrupt what is the natural order or describing things biblical, but it doesn't actually mean what you think it means. It is a really rich text, as you said, Sylvia. I did find it delightful, especially the end, and I will not spoil the end.
I love the end.
Yeah, but you get a sense that for Titus, moving forward, kind of like with Ike from Razorblade Tears, you don't know what the future holds for them. You know what he's going to do, but you don't know what the future holds for him. But I think when you see how it ends, there's something optimistic about that, And one thing we didn't mention is that it's set in 2017. I don't think that's an accident by any stretch of the imagination. And there's a pivotal scene that occurs during the fall festival that people might find that resonates. Especially as it relates to Virginia.
It's clear that he drew from real life events to kind of inform some of that scene. Like you'd be hard pressed not to think about certain things that have happened that one isn't reminiscent of. So, and there's this, and so I wouldn't say it's a political commentary. I don't think that, but I definitely think there's a larger cultural commentary that's being made. That reminds me of one thing that I do admire about S.A Cosby's work, doing all this like Southern Gothic crime thriller fiction work, is that even though it's political, it's not heavy-handed. Like I don't feel like he's going on this like liberal high horse, right? I feel like he lays it out for you to see. And you come to these conclusions about them, on your own. But I don't typically get the sense from him that he's creating, aside from like some of the Sons of Confederacy people and some of the, what's it called in the other book, in Razorblade Tears, what's the bike gang called?
Oh, Rare Breed.
Yeah, they do appear.
They do appear.
So some of that is like a little parody, like buffoonish type of thing. But like I'm thinking of the character of Tom, one of the deputies, who is put on administrative leave for some misconduct. And what I find hopeful about S.A Cosby's work is that he, I think, believes in people's moral goodness. I think he does, aside from the killer, obviously. There's no moral goodness there. But,
or even redemption. Room for redemption.
And the fact that, like, Titus chooses to appeal to Tom's, like, sense of shame and goodness and being made right. And I think at the time that I read it was very refreshing to me, right? To believe that people still have that, because I think it's easy, especially now, like in the context that we're reading it and we're encountering all these stories on the news, it's very easy to become cynical and jaded about what people are like internally. Where's your moral compass, and everything can feel skewed. But one thing I appreciate about the way he writes his characters is even the killer like genuinely has these thoughts, you know, and it's not so overly simplistic, I guess, in terms of you're good, you're bad, you're evil.
Yeah,
you know?
they're complex.
Yeah.
They're complicated. Yeah.
Yeah.
You kind of started with this, Kofi, but one of the things I found delightful was his father.
Oh, yeah, Albert.
Yeah, and the way they describe his past, he probably wasn't a delightful person then, but the way, so when he first introduces the father's character, I kind of braced myself for, is he going to be, because obviously they live together, is Cosby going to create a home for Titus that is contentious and difficult, or is he going to create a home that can be a home? I mean, I just really love this character, and I like that home continues to stay in the book as a place where he deals with the craziness outside, and then he still comes home. And yes, there is, you know, he might argue with Darlene or whatever, but it feels like home with Albert in it is home, and it's sort of where he retreats to and gets a good meal. Yeah. So I really appreciated that, because I think often what we get is the old Albert, the father figure like that, right? Whereas we have this reformed Albert who, yes, they disagree, especially about church and things like that, but their relationship was delightful, and they're back and forth, especially with the brother. Once the brother comes back into the picture, really, that I really like that element of the narrative he's building.
I think that you're pinpointing why I felt anxious about it, that the home, because there's a scene where the home gets violated.
Yes,
and I was really upset that they were going to do something to Albert.
Right.
But spoiler alert, nothing happens to Albert. Albert's all good. He's tending to his church's garden and doing all the stuff. But like, that I think was an interesting choice to like take that safe, you know, nice little place and kind of put it in peril, because as a reader, that's when I felt most like, oh my God, like unsettled, uncentered. I think it's because exactly what you said.
And it's a point that Cosby is making, and that these choices that he's making to build his world, Titus's world, it's his father who is that figure in this book, not his mother. His mother is absent, obviously, because she's passed. And then it's a brother, not sister. So I think he, in creating this very male household or relationships, he makes it tender. You know, even when he and his brother are not speaking to each other and arguing or whatever, ultimately it turns out to be a loving relationship of two brothers and their father. And at the end of the day, that was really delightful.
Yeah. And one of the things that I wanted to mention and say is that there's a real logic to a lot of the characters, even the serial killer.
Yeah.
And I think that if you've ever experienced trauma or you ever experienced, you know, a loss, the religiousness or religiosity in the society wants you to think of this as part of God's plan, right? And at the same time, you have within those religions that God can be a savior, right? And I think both Titus and the serial killer experience a loss and a trauma where that put the notion of God in question. And I think that is something that a lot of people wrestle with and a lot of people struggle with, even those who are religious. How can these things happen? And I think Albert is more consistent in his ideology, in that there's no question his plan is bigger than our plan. And I thought one of the funnier scenes is when Titus confronts Albert's pastor at the funeral because he's looking at him like, you got 500 suits. You're gonna get rid of the garden, you know. And I think there's a part where he says, where Titus is saying that the church isn't the building, it's the garden. It's what Jean, the friend, was doing. And that was one of those scenes when Albert asks Titus to come with him, was one of those tender scenes, because you can tell Titus, I don't want to do that. I got too much time to do things. But
I think, to kind of, we're going to wrap up here, but, you know, one other, as you're talking, both of you, thing that kind of clicked for me in this book that's similar to Razorblade Tears is, you know, S.A. Cosby, I think, is committed, and he mentions this in an interview, to really exploring what kind of emotional trauma, how that grief and the processing and the loss and the dealing with that trauma shows up for men in particular, men in the South, and how these different male characters encounter their trauma and what comes of it, I think is a really interesting study in and of itself. So,
especially Black men.
yes, Black men in particular is what he said. Yeah. So anyways, that's all we have time for today. I hope that for those of you listening, you would be you're interested in picking up All Listeners Bleed by S.A Cosby. It is widely available. And if you read it, share your thoughts with us. We'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for tuning in. Again, this has been Sylvia, Kofi, and Laura. Till next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed what you just heard, we have a whole universe of podcasts waiting for you. Simply search Dragon Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can also explore our full lineup and discover new shows at podbean.com/dragonpodcasts. That's podbean.com/dragonpodcasts.